So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this BASIS Wednesday webinar. My name is Russell Seymour. I'm Chief Executive of BASIS, British Association for Sustainable Sport. And BASIS really exists to facilitate these conversations between our members. We're sharing best practice so we can reduce our environmental impacts while we're realising the great social and economic benefits that sport can bring. And that's why we run these webinar series. And I'll come back to today's session in just a moment. Now, for those of you who've been around for a while and have seen me introduce these BASIS webinars before, you'll know that I used to give a list of environmental incidents from around the world to demonstrate the impacts that were happening. But to be honest, it kind of feels redundant now because there seems to be so much happening. There's reports every day of fire, of flood, of heat, of famine. And it may be that there's just more of an inclination to report in the mainstream media, but the frequency of these incidents, it certainly seems that they're increasing, and clearly it's a reality that sport just can't ignore. The IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from just a couple of weeks ago, was absolutely clear that the scale of human-caused changes, and it is human-caused changes, but the scale of those changes to the climate system are unprecedented over thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. And there was a UNICEF report this week that demonstrated the devastating impact of climate change on millions of children. And even this morning, it was reported that the famine in Madagascar, which is affecting somewhere in the region of 3 million people, has been directly attributed to the impacts of climate change because of a drought that's been going on for 3-4 years. Now, we've got to recognise that there are other impacts beyond climate change, and we'll probably touch on some of those this afternoon. But it's foremost in our mind because of the COP26 talks being held in November in Glasgow. And we're optimistic that BASIS will be present and we'll be able to talk about sport at those talks, but we're still waiting to hear. But we should also recall that there's COP15 talks on biodiversity that are taking place in China in October before that meeting. So this afternoon's session is going to be delivered by Matthew Campelli. Matthew's Director of Sustainability for Touchline. He's the founder of the Sustainability Report. I actually don't remember when I first met Matthew, but I do recall a phone conversation probably 4 years ago, and I was stood on a very cold, windy station when Matthew described his idea of a sustainability publication just focusing on sport, and asked if I thought it would be a good idea. I said that it would be, and from that, the Sustainability Report was born. Now, I don't mean to say that it was on my suggestion. I'm sure Matthew took a lot of advice from a lot of people, but I think the Sustainability Report has become one of the absolute key resources for sharing relevant sustainability information for sport globally. Matthew's going to talk about leveraging sustainability to achieve sport business objectives. So please feel free to post your thoughts, your comments, questions in the chat as we go along, but we'll save the questions until the end, when we're going to have a general Q&A session. And we'll keep going as long as the questions keep coming, but we will have a cut-off of an hour, so at 3 o'clock. Please stay on mute. Please check that you are muted, unless we actually ask you to unmute to ask your question. And we suggest that you switch now to speaker view. But on that, I will hand over to Matthew.
Thank you very much, Russell. That's one of the warmest introductions I think I've ever had, and and yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us today on a August weekday afternoon. I really appreciate it. So, as Russell says, today I'm going to be talking a little bit around how we can leverage sustainability to achieve, or to help sports organisations achieve their kind of core objectives. I mean, Russell hasn't gone into too much detail on some of the environmental incidents happening around the world because, like he said, they're very high profile. They're being covered extensively by the mainstream media now. And I think the thoughts of myself and Russell, and maybe many of us in this room, is that sustainability for sustainability's sake is about the best business case that can be made for doing things right by the environment. But we have to live in a kind of realistic, we have to have kind of realistic expectations when it comes to business, and particularly the sports industry. That my experience is that if we talk about sustainability for sustainability's sake, many people in sport won't think it's a core consideration, even though my fundamental opinion is that sustainability and climate change and environmental issues should be right at sports, at the heart of sports agenda. But talking about it in other kind of aspects around fan engagement, engaging sponsors, risk management, is perhaps an engaging way to talk about sustainability to people working in the sports sector. Today, I'm going to be talking about sport in terms of sport as a product. And the reason I'm doing that is because, and I'm doing that very intentionally, because although talking about sport as a product is quite a dispassionate, unromantic way to talk about sport, we all know that sport is a very different industry to other industries and other sectors. But we're going to talk about it from the sense of trying to incorporate sustainability and making sport a better product through incorporating sustainability in a very genuine, intentional way. The first thing we have to ask ourselves, though, is sport a good product as it is already? I think many of us on this webinar, particularly after this incredible summer of sport that has occurred against all the odds, that sport fundamentally, for all its flaws, is a wonderful product. There are many characteristics of sport that keep us engaged and keep us coming back for more. Obviously, entertainment will be first and foremost one of sport's key strengths. We all come back for the unscripted drama. Sport is first and foremost about making people forget about the stresses and struggles of day-to-day life and keeping them entertained and making them happy for a period of time. Sport also gives structure to our lives. If we follow a particular football team or a cricket team, we might have a season ticket. We might watch their games on a regular basis. There's a World Cup every 4 years in many sports, or a World Championships every year. We have the Ashes series every couple of years. So sport is a fundamental part of our calendar in the same way that religious ceremonies will be a fundamental part of our calendar. They give structure to our lives. It gives structure to our lives. But at the same time, it's got an unpredictability that keeps us coming back for more. Although many of the favorites will win games and competitions and tournaments, that there's always an element of surprise in sport that makes us want to come back for a little bit more to see if something out of the ordinary is going to happen. We aspire to be like our favorite athletes and coaches. It gives us aspiration in life, and also there's a sense of belonging. Many of us come together to follow a sport, a particular team, regardless of other aspects of our lives, our demography, our political persuasion. If we follow a particular team or a particular sport, we feel a kind of engendered spirit with other people as well. So sport fundamentally, because of many things, is a good product. But we're seeing changing attitudes and behaviors of some of sports key stakeholders, and we'll be discussing that a little bit today. We're talking about fans, we're talking about sponsors, we're talking about partners. And if we talk about fans, just for an example, there's a wonderful organization called the Sports Innovation Lab based in the US, which was founded by Angela Ruggiero, former Olympian, I think an Olympic gold medalist. And they come up with really interesting data, really interesting research on a regular basis. And about a year or two ago, they coined this idea of the fluid fan. So looking at fans and how fans are changing their perception and changing their attitudes. So fans of a certain generation would follow their sports team through thick and thin, no matter what. They'd buy a season ticket, they'd go and watch the games, they'd buy the merchandise. Whereas now, this new generation of fans is more fickle, more willing to change their minds and change their opinions. And they got more choice than ever before. It's very difficult to keep up with them because they're continuously evolving in their choices. They tend to follow athletes and causes more than teams more generally. So the reason I'm kind of framing sport as a product is because fans are slightly turning into consumers in many ways rather than being these kind of hardcore fans, and we should be thinking about sport as a product in that way. So when we talk about the quality of products, we tend to think about user experience. How do users, in this case fans or consumers, think and feel about sport as a product, either a sports team or sport in general? And a famous model from Peter Morville is his user experience honeycomb, which looks at the 7 criteria for deciding whether something is a good product, whether it's useful, findable, credible, valuable, usable, desirable, and accessible. These are the 7 criteria that a product or service must hit for it to have a good user experience. When we talk about sport could easily fit in 7 of these criteria. And for clarity, when we talk about usefulness, that doesn't necessarily mean usefulness from a very practical point of view. It can mean for engagement and for enjoyment as well. But for the purpose of today's presentation and today's talk, we're going to be looking at this kind of feel quadrant of this honeycomb, and looking at credibility and desirability, and looking at how credible and desirable sport is for its stakeholders, and the stakeholders with their changing behaviors and changing attitudes. In terms of credibility, there's numerous statistics and research coming out now showing that people involved in sport stakeholders, want sport to become better governed, more environmentally, more socially aware. I'll reel off a couple for you now to paint a little bit of a picture. So 87% of forward-thinking consumers, so termed presumers by Havas Sport and Entertainment, believe that sport must take action to reduce its negative environmental footprint. That's a pretty overwhelming number of people who think that sport must be looking at the environment and taking steps to improve its footprint in this respect. Within sport, the majority of sport leaders highlighted transparency and good governance as the key issue that sport needs to address in PricewaterhouseCoopers 2019 sports survey. And when we think about transparency and good governance, being environmentally aware and being socially aware is obviously a huge part of good governance and transparency as well. And when we think about sponsors who are really important to driving sport, funding sport, and really set the agenda in sport in many ways, the majority of big brands, big sponsors will be talking the language of sustainability. 6 out of 10 of the biggest sponsors in sport publish sustainability reports and sustainability data on a regular basis. And all of them talk about sustainability in some form and have sustainability targets, whether that's a net zero target, a zero waste target, or human rights targets. They'll all have sustainability targets. And increasingly, we're seeing sponsors and sports partners wanting to align with sports, athletes, and other organizations who have got similar persuasions. When it comes to the desirability, do fans and other stakeholders want to align with sport more closely? Post-pandemic, Nielsen came out with some interesting statistics. It showed that 75% of sports fans have an increased interest in brands that are socially responsible. Sports organizations, by extension, are part of that group of brands, and more fans are wanting to see their team doing more around the environment, doing more around social issues. Pre-COVID, Deloitte had a piece of research that showed that fans will establish a deeper connection with a team if they were linked with a relevant cause or value. And I know that there's been a bone of contention around consumer spending and whether consumer research and consumer spending around sustainable products go hand in hand. And I think there was a school of thought recently that while consumers tend to respond to surveys that they will spend money on sustainable products, they're still generally motivated by price and other issues. But there was an interesting piece of research that came out last year, a really interesting Harvard Business Review article that showed that consumers are actually spending more on sustainable products because organizations that are producing sustainable goods are growing at a faster rate than those that aren't. So people are willing to spend money on sustainable products and on brands that have got real sustainable credentials. And one of the most interesting things for people involved in sport is how is this actually going to affect sport on a practical sense? Will sponsors actually spend more money on brands, on sports that are going to have a sustainability agenda? And Nielsen came out with I think a really flagship piece of research a few months ago that showed that over the next 3 to 5 years, they believe that sports rights holders with a genuine sustainability agenda will increase their sponsorship revenue by 10% more than their counterparts that don't do that. There's an increasing demand from brands to find sports platforms that enhance their brand and showcase what they stand for. Samantha Lamberti of Nielsen Sports said when I interviewed her about this piece of research. So this could be really significant and something that we should really be thinking about when we're designing our strategies as sports organizations. How can we engage with brands and sponsors in a way that makes them want to, engage with us more and build deeper relationships with us? And to put this in a kind of a metaphor or analogy, my view is that reshaping the sports industry in a post-COVID world, and in this world where these attitudes are changing to this extent, Reshaping the sports industry without taking into account these changing attitudes and expectations is like a sports coach watching their team from the sidelines losing without thinking about changing tactics. It just isn't going to wash in the present and in the future. So my central argument of this presentation is that placing sustainability at the heart of your club, league or federation will undoubtedly make your offering a better product. We've talked about it to some extent with fan engagement. We've talked about it to some extent for stronger commercial partnerships, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the second part of the presentation as well. But it works in a whole myriad of topics. As Russell talked about in the kind of at the start of the presentation, it helps with operational efficiency, organizational efficiency, and risk management. There are some sports that are creating a USP and carving a USP out for themselves because they're being very intentional about the environment and even social topics as well. And you can even engage with local or national government at a policy level, which I think is probably the most impactful way that sport can make a stance environmentally. So there are many ways that sport can make itself, or sports teams can make themselves a better offering by being very intentional about sustainability and the environment. Just a couple of things I want to touch on that have happened over the past year that kind of illustrate this point is during COVID, we saw that sports organizations generally took a huge hit in revenue, particularly around sponsorship and money from gate receipts and from spectators. A couple of organizations bucked that trend. And I know that we always talk about Forest Green Rovers as a kind of reference point for the environment, but it's very difficult not to talk about them because they do things in such a fundamental way. And they actually, over that period where people were losing money around sponsorship, they actually doubled their sponsorship over that period of time. They were engaging with sponsors that hadn't previously engaged with sports, just because of their reach around the world, because of their focus on the environment, their absolute core focus on environmental protection. Well, we're seeing partners and sponsors who previously had no traditional relationship with sport actually get involved in sport. About a year and a half ago, I spoke to Nico Briskorn at Wolfsburg, German Bundesliga team, who was telling me that they get engaging, quite a few brands who had never previously engaged with football or with sport before, but they wanted to get involved because they saw that they were producing a sustainability report every year. They were doing the right things around the environment, that they had a net zero policy as well. So there are opportunities to create not only deepen relationships with existing partners, but to create new opportunities to find new partners by actually doing things around sustainability and aligning with their objectives as well. We're seeing teams like Real Betis, Spanish football team, and I can see that we've got a bit of a theme going here with football teams wearing green football kits. But we're seeing teams like Real Betis become a bit of a convener around sustainability. They've created their Forever Green program, which is trying to encourage local businesses and even wider businesses get involved with sustainability and share best practice as well, which is a really interesting way to kind of deepen relationships and build engagements and build relationships with other stakeholders around them. And sustainability is also an opportunity to strengthen existing partnerships as well. Just going back to the piece of research from Nielsen around sponsorship, one of the key kind of trends that I saw towards the end of last year were existing sponsorship deals being renewed with a sustainability angle. So, for example, we saw the IOC renegotiate their partnership with Procter & Gamble for the next 4 years, I think up until the Paris 2024 games. And sustainability was a key part of that partnership. We saw UEFA do something similar with PepsiCo. They renewed their partnership with PepsiCo for the Champions League up until 2024. One of the key components of that relationship was trying to eliminate waste and reduce single-use plastics as well. So we're seeing these traditional sports sponsorships kind of evolve in some way, so sustainability becomes part of them as well. And on the governance side, we're seeing large sports properties actually think about it in a kind of looking at sustainability from a good governance point of view. La Liga, the Spanish Football League, have recently started to coach and engage a lot of their football teams on how they can file non-financial reports and how they can do non-financial reporting and sustainability reporting in line with the European Union guidelines, which I think is a really interesting project, because all sports organizations in the EU that have a revenue above a certain amount or employees above a certain number will have to produce non-financial reports in line with EU legislation. So it's really interesting that we're seeing a wider football umbrella, big football league, try and get its teams on board by giving them, real good advice on how to produce these documents. I want to talk to you through a couple of case studies now, and it's a little bit difficult because I know sport's been in a funny position for a couple of years because of COVID. But one of the really interesting projects that I've come across in that period, just before COVID, was this relationship that Ball, the unit manufacturer, has created with a number of big sports organizations like Arsenal Football Club, like the LA Rams in America, and a couple of sports franchises in Denver, Colorado. And they're obviously looking at, reducing single-use plastics and replacing it with a recyclable material. But at the same time, they're trying to really make it engaging and try and get fans to engage with it. So the first thing was they wanted to create a product that was a better product for fans.
I'm always here.
So, hello, is someone on the line? I can hear someone come through. And if you are, please feel free to mute your microphone. Thank you. Sorry. So the first thing they wanted to do was they wanted to produce a product that was better than the single-use plastic product, so fans would have a better experience in the stadium when they're drinking their beer or drinking their soft drink or whatever. But one of the things they wanted to do pre-COVID was kind of gamify the process as well. So, for example, they wanted to create a selection of bins or selection of waste units, with players' names on the units, and spectators could vote for their man of the match or woman of the match or MVP by putting their unit by putting their cup in a particular waste unit or particular bin, which really kind of adds to the experience, gives it a better overall experience, and kind of gamifies sustainability, makes them think about it in a more fun way, and actually improves the match day experience as well. So, not about making sustainability a sacrifice, but making it an add-on, a value add, which I think is a really interesting way to get fans involved in a kind of sustainability conversation. Another project that really caught my eye is a little bit of a controversial one, because I know that TSG Hoffenheim, for fans of German football, are a little bit of a bogey club in Germany and in the football Bundesliga, mainly because of their ownership structure. I know the majority of German Bundesliga clubs are majority owned by fans, and there's a big fan ownership kind of culture over there, whereas TSG Hoffenheim are owned by one individual billionaire who owns, I think, about 80% of the football club, kind of going against the grain there. But they've done an awful lot around trying to engage different stakeholders in the kind of sustainability topic. So they've got sustainability as part of their sponsorship strategy. Their naming rights deal, the PreZero Arena for their stadium, is with a waste management company that specializes in recycling and circular economy. And they also created something called a climate ticket, which I think is a really interesting concept. And what they've basically done is they're selling match tickets to fans, giving them the opportunity to spend, I think, €1 or €2 extra on their ticket, and that €1 or €2 will go towards a reforestation project somewhere. So it's a really kind of low barrier way to engage fans and get them involved in a sustainability project as well. I know that we can have a big conversation about offsetting and how good offsetting is in a kind of wider context of carbon reduction, but as a way of kind of easing fans into the kind of concept of managing carbon and making an impact, this is kind of a really kind of easy way to get them to think about it and make it very low stress, make it very low barrier to entry, and kind of adding to their experience as a fan. I want to finish this presentation off with a little story, and it's based around the World Athletics air quality project, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And just to give you a bit of context before I go through it, about 2 years ago, World Athletics decided that they were going to concentrate on air quality as one of their key sustainability topics, mainly because air quality really affects their key stakeholders, elite and recreational runners, particularly those who are running in big cities. Air pollution is rife. Air pollution is a big issue for a lot of us now, and COVID has really heightened our kind of awareness of air pollution, because I think there's some statistics somewhere that show that in places where air pollution is particularly high, people have generally suffered more with COVID because it's obviously a lung and respiratory disease. So when I found out about this project, I really wanted to find out more about it, and there was an opportunity to go and meet and interview the World Athletics president, Seb Coe, about a year and a half ago, and about 2 years ago actually. And they gave me 15. They said they gave me a 15-minute interview with Seb Coe, and I took an 8-hour night train from my home in Austria to Zurich to get this 15 minutes, because first of all, I wanted to meet Seb Coe because he's one of my sporting heroes. And secondly, because I thought this was a really, really interesting project and I needed to find out more about it. So I got there, we sat down, and he'd been speaking to press all day, and he was kind of a little bit tired, and it was just before the Diamond League event that they were having. And we sat down, and the minute I started to talk about sustainability and the Air Quality Project, that 15 minutes turned into about 35 or 40 minutes because he became animated. He was really keen on talking about it. And he basically said a couple of things that I thought were really profound, particularly in the context of making your sport a better product and a better and a more robust organization and more robust industry. And he said that young people don't just look at your organization or sport as a political party or a sports federation or as a tech business in isolation. They look at you and ask a fundamental question: do you look like the world that I live in? Do you look like the world that I want to live in? And he said that even though sports organizations, federations in general, weren't really cash-rich businesses compared to other big, massive corporations, he said that he wanted his federation, World Athletics, to be able to say something important about an important issue, no matter how small that was. And I really thought about that, and I thought that was a really interesting way and a really, really smart way for sports organizations to really look at sustainability and tackle it by looking at a sustainability issue that is totally intrinsic to your key stakeholders and trying to really make a difference and do something about that, rather than taking a kind of ad hoc scattergun approach to it, really thinking about it. And now, again, over the past couple of years, what we're seeing sports that are kind of being born out of sustainability rather than the other way around. There are a number of really interesting sports now that are happening that have really got sustainability as a core part of their ethos. SailGP is one that I find really super interesting. I mean, it's kind of a fledgling, emerging sports brand. I think they're in their second season now, but the stuff they're doing around sustainability is truly, in my opinion, really kind of game changing. So I don't know if many of you follow SailGP or if you've seen what they've been doing recently, but they've created this thing called the Impact League.
Okay, for me, it looks like Matthew's actually frozen there. Let's just give him a minute, see if he comes back. Bear with me. I will try and get Matthew.
Russ, am I there? Am I?
Yeah, you're back with us now. You froze just for 30, 40 seconds, maybe.
Sorry, Russ, where did I get to?
You were, what were your final words? I was writing something down as you were talking.
So I was talking about SailGP
again. You were going through SailGP. Yeah.
I think I was talking about SailGP again. And so I was talking about the Impact League that they launched a little while ago. And as well as giving sailors points for what they do in the water, they give sailors points for sustainability activations that they do around each event as well. So really gamifying the process and making it really part of the competition as well, which I think is super interesting. I've got Extreme E as well, which I think is a really interesting property. I think Russell Basis is going to be doing a webinar with SailGP with Extreme E coming up, and the fact that they've really made a sport which is geared around looking at some of the most desolate habitats on the planet and showing what the world could be like if we don't change things drastically, I think is a really interesting concept and really engaging. And so far, I think it's engaged an awful lot of people out there, not just sports fans, but people engaged with the environment as well, and really brought those two kind of demographics and audiences together. And just a final sport I think is really, what they're doing is really interesting is, I know many of you have followed the ocean race for some time now, but I recently became aware of stuff they're doing around policy and trying to lobby around creating rights for the ocean and rights for nature, and really putting a package of recommendations together around this to present to the United Nations at some point over the next couple of years. And sport really getting involved in policy around something that's intrinsic to the sport, I think is really interesting, because it makes policy, which is a very dry, uninteresting subject for many people, making it actually engaging and approachable. So I think we're moving into a stage now where, as well as sustainability creeping into sport and becoming a part of sports core business, we're seeing sports actually being created around sustainability as a key point. So there are three considerations to make about, when we talk about sustainability and making it making it as part as a core part of your sport, and actually making your sport a better product through sustainability. And the first factor is that the action you take around sustainability has to be really meaningful. It can't be done for PR purposes. Of course, once you've done the real work of actually reducing your footprint, reducing your emissions, reducing your waste, then yes, obviously it's great to create a good narrative, a good story around that. But the hard work is the most important part. What you do has to be real, meaningful, and honest. There has to be a natural fit. Just when we're talking about examples like World Athletics looking at air quality, we're talking about the ocean race, looking at ocean health and ocean plastics. There's a natural fit there. So people who are already engaged with the sport and the property can see what's happening, and they can see that there's a natural fit, and it can become more engaging with them. If you try and do something that's not a natural fit, then it kind of disorientates people, and it becomes a little bit difficult to kind of put the two together. So it's got to be really meaningful. There has to be a natural fit. And when you do communicate about your sustainability achievements and what your objectives are, the communication has to be honest. I can't stress that enough. It has to be honest about where you are in the process. You can't boost things up to a place where they're not and try and kind of exaggerate where you are. It has to be honest. It has to be non-cliche, and it has to be specific and personal. So rather than looking at the kind of macro big issues that a lot of sports fans might shy away from, or that might wash over them, making it personal about their own communities, about their own families, their jobs, things that are personal to them, that goes a long way to actually making them really want to engage with it and getting them to think about sustainability and how your brand and your sport actually is doing things around it that's really meaningful. So I'm going to end my presentation there. Just a couple of thoughts that I'd like to take into our Q&A and our discussion. But I'll be really keen to find out what you all think about my thoughts, and to just talk about it and have a bit of a discussion. So Russell, I'll pass it back over to you.
Lovely, Matthew, thank you. I think there's quite a lot in there. We've got a few questions have come through, but if anybody wants to either raise a hand or put some more comments into the chat, then please do so. Matthew, I'm going to come back to you on your three considerations at the end. I've got a couple of questions to kick off. The three words I wrote down, just to paraphrase your bit, were real, natural, and then honest, personal. So 4 words, but under those 3 headings. For some sports, it may not be an obvious natural fit. And I'm thinking in terms of the practical side of it. For a venue, if you're trying to improve your recycling rates, it's not necessarily a natural fit to put up signage when people are there to watch cricket or football. So how do you, I guess that links into the personal side of it and actually making it real for the spectator, for the consumer who's coming in. Just thinking how something like sailing, there is a clear natural fit. You're in the water, and if that water is polluted and unpleasant, you don't really want to be there. How do you make those links, particularly if you're an indoor sport or one that isn't as closely related to the environment?
Well, yeah, I take your point that there are sports that are more naturally, intrinsically linked to the environment. But my kind of impression, my feeling is that all sports, even indoor sports, in some way are linked to some kind of environmental issues. So even if we talk about indoor sports, for example, we're still talking about things like, even we talked about air pollution as an example for World Athletics, but indoor air pollution is as deadly or as kind of volatile as outdoor air pollution as well. So you can still kind of make links with your sport. It would take some, my opinion is it will take some work to kind of figure out what those key issues are. We kind of look at the kind of major macro issues like, reducing your carbon, reducing your waste. But if you kind of look at things in a more kind of micro way about the various kind of subtopics around sustainability and how that kind of impacts where your venue is, where your team is located, what the people around your arena do for jobs, what their communities are like, you'll be able to find an environmental topic that really feeds into people's lives around that sport and around that location, and build a kind of a project and narrative around that. So, for example, if your location, if your arena is in a seaside town or a coastal town, for example, you could very much make the case around kind of rising sea levels and how that's going to impact the arena going forward. If the arena is going to be there in 10 years' time, what that means for the community around them as well. So, it just takes a little bit of creative thinking, a little bit of knowledge around the sustainability issues beyond the kind of big macro stuff, and really kind of tailoring it to people's concerns that are in your immediate kind of stakeholder base or your key catchment area, I guess.
So it's finding that hook, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like a marketing campaign. You find your hook that's going to grab people's interest.
Yeah.
I'm going to. I have got a couple of other questions from your presentation, but I'm going to turn to the audience, as it were. And I think there was a piece you were sort of saying about language as well, and sort of definition. So I don't know. I mean, John Swanwick, you made a comment here about that there's a language issue about what sustainability actually means. Do you want to jump in and ask your question directly?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. I mean, it's more a comment really on what I heard. And I heard talking about sustainable and sustainability. And my view is quite clearly that if you detach what I understand to be environmental sustainability from the economic sustainability of organizations, whether that's businesses or sporting organizations or voluntary organizations, you're going to end up in real problems trying to take the debate forward within those organizations in any way that's meaningful to the way they're run. I'd just give an example. I mean, I've been working on a project looking at the long-term economic sustainability of the top 1,500 businesses in the world. And as it currently stands at current prices of carbon, whether that's licensing or certificates or offsetting, those businesses are long-term viable. Once you start getting to potential carbon costs of $100 a ton, then probably 100 of those businesses are no longer viable. If you get to $300 a ton, which is not inconceivable in relatively short term, you're talking about 500 of those top 1,500 businesses in the world that are no longer viable economically. I wonder how many people on the call can do that sort of calculation for their own sporting organizations, and what the implications of that might be, both in the shorter and the longer term.
That's a really good point, but I suppose my answer to that would be, I mean, what's the alternative? I mean, if we carry on at the current trajectory, nothing's going to be viable at some point down the line. So we've got to make the kind of economic, we have to look at the kind of cost benefit analysis and see, you know, where we see sustainability as a environmental, in this case, as a priority for organizations. If you're a sport that sees a significant part of its calendar is reduced by a significant amount every year because of climate change, then your economic viability starts to become a lot less solid. So I totally take your argument on board, and it's a very difficult position for a lot of organizations to be in, particularly some sports organizations that aren't cash rich, don't have a huge amount of resources. Trying to get them to tackle sustainability in a meaningful way is quite a stretch. But I think there are some creative ways that you can go about doing it that are really kind of that can keep it intrinsic to the sport and also increase its economic viability as well. Now I know that some of this stuff around sponsorship and fan engagement is a little bit theoretical, and there still needs to be some hard data to back up whether sponsors are going to spend more money on a sustainable property as opposed to a non-sustainable property. But that seems to be the direction of travel. And as long as you're showing that you're doing things in a very kind of a genuine way, the majority of sponsors and businesses and brands will want to align with that, and they'll want to not only align with that, but they'll also see a way for your sport and your brand to kind of help them with their own sustainability projects as well, because there's a certain profile sport has, even though a lot of it is not cash rich, it's very culturally significant. There's a way that you can help organizations with their own kind of sustainability endeavors as well. So there is an economic case to be made for sport to become more sustainable, but I take your point. There are some key considerations there to think about.
What I'm trying to really get at is that for all organizations, they're going to have to look at their business models as it currently stands and actually decide whether that's long-term sustainable.
Yes.
And I think there's some fundamental transformation that's going to have to take place in a lot of businesses and a lot of other non-business organizations. And that's before you even start to consider the possibilities of organizations having to take into account the so-called scope 3 or the behaviors of their customers and their suppliers and what they do with the product that they're being supplied with. And I think that has significant implications for sport, where I suspect quite a lot of the environmental sustainability issues lie for most sports organisations.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Russell will know better than anyone that Scope 3 is where sport is really having a bit of a bottleneck. But yeah, I mean, like you said, I mean, in terms of business models, I mean, sport is most sports organisations have a very short-term kind of view of things. It's always the next event, and there will be some kind of transformation that will need to happen for it to become more long-term thinking. But it's a question of governance, and it's going to be quite tricky to change that. But I think it's absolutely necessary. But
yeah. I think there is that paradox of time is interesting, because your planning is for the next season, or the next match or the next season, but there is no football club, cricket club, rugby club that is not thinking that they're going to be here for their community, for their fans, for 50 years, 100 years and into the future. So there are opportunities to push that forward. And just coming back on the economic, John, absolutely take your point on what I would call financial sustainability, maybe it's that or viability. There's a whole piece around economic sustainability as well, which is about how you spend your money, not just your profits and losses, but how your club actually interacts with the community, about local employment, about using local smaller suppliers. Those kind of things also come into it. It's in addition to your point, which is absolutely valid, but there's a whole piece around economic sustainability which has a slightly different focus as well.
And I think the point I was making, really essentially, I said in the comment on the inbox, was basically that if you that word sustainable and then using it solely in the context of environmental sustainability, I think is just denying a lot of issues that feed into this whole agenda. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of talking about economic sustainability, because that's the sort of terminology that people understand quite intuitively without having to understand a whole range of different issues that underpin it. Yeah. And I think environment is a critical part of that, and it's not that long term. I mean, if there are fundamental decisions made in the next few months, COP26 plus, around the direction of travel in terms of carbon pricing and responsibility for emissions from suppliers and the whole scoping thing, then that's not going to be a long-term agenda. That's going to be quite a significant hit short-term for a lot of people.
Yeah. And it comes down to language, different people's understandings, different angles on this, and we've got to get some kind of clarity, some kind of leadership, probably political leadership coming in on this as well. Thanks, John. I'm going to jump on to, we've got some comments and questions about the role of players and athletes. Rory, do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Yeah, happily. Yeah, thanks, Russell. Yeah, Matthew, really enjoyed that. It would be great to actually, I don't know whether the presentation will be shared afterwards. It would be great to get a copy and obviously share it with my internal network and just sort of spread the word. But it was pretty simple. I mean, I work in the sports agency with athletes, and my view is that the key stakeholders, obviously the fans, are present, but to influence them, I really feel that if you can get a couple of key ambassadors as in athletes or players or personalities that can really be educated, know what to say, use their platforms. You see some of these guys have huge followers and huge influence. How important do you see the role of those key stakeholders, the players, the athletes, in generating these sort of social changes?
Yeah, cheers, Rory. Good question. I think so. Athlete activism, I think, has changed a lot over the years. Whereas in previous years, I mean, we all kind of eulogize people like Muhammad Ali and Billie Jean King now, but at a time when they were actually kind of battling the system, they weren't universally kind of well liked or marketable, particularly athletes. Whereas now, I think if you are an athlete activist, a genuine one, then you are a bit more marketable, I suppose. People like Marcus Rashford and Megan Rapinoe are very much on the world stage now, and that's very much down to their activism as well as their exploits on the field, I think. I think there are a couple of things here, particularly when it comes to the environment, which should make things a little bit tricky, and maybe you've discussed this on previous basis webinars. I think climate, when we talk about climate and environment compared to other issues, I think you talked about racism in your comment, for example. I think when it comes to climate, I think athletes feel a little bit vulnerable when talking about issues like climate, particularly athletes who are paid quite well and athletes who've got a certain lifestyle, particularly top level footballers or NFL stars or NBA stars, and they may feel they're not in a position to talk about climate change just because their lifestyle can make them can paint them as a little bit of a hypocrite in many ways, because they'll be flying around the world doing their sports. They might have big cars, big houses. They'll be using more resources than the majority of the population, and there'll be some concern there about whether their credibility is. If they're credible spokespeople for that particular issue. So, for example, Marcus Rashford was a totally credible spokesperson when it came to free school meals, because he was that child 15, 20 years ago. He was a child who was growing up in a struggling household who had to rely on these free school meals. So he's got a very kind of intrinsic story to tell. Whereas if he was telling a story about climate, people could look at him, flying around Europe to play for Manchester United and playing for England, and there's a case to be made for him, it not being an easy story to tell. Having said that, I don't think that should stop athletes from talking about climate, particularly if they're engaged in it. I think more athletes should be engaged in climate, because it is the issue of our times now, and I think it's just about education, really, about how they can kind of not just adapt their lifestyles to be a little bit more sustainable, and to showcase that even if you are a high-paid athlete and you are flying around the world, that you can live a more modest and sustainable life, but also about how they can kind of bat back those kind of accusations of hypocrisy. Like I said, I think that's going to be a tricky sell, but I think athletes are going to be quite important to this conversation, because they represent a lot of the generation that I was talking about, this kind of fluid fan generation, where a younger generation of sports fans are following athletes rather than teams now, more generally. So sorry, that's quite a long-winded answer to your question. But the other thing that I will say very quickly as a kind of add-on to that is, when we talk about sponsors and teams, I'm actually putting together a piece of work now around athletes and athlete activists around climate. And a few of the athletes that I've spoken to, who are not kind of high-profile household name athletes by any stretch of the imagination, have said that now that they've aligned with the cause around environment, there's one athlete I spoke to in particular who's doing a lot around ocean plastics and waste in the ocean, and said that now when he has conversations with potential sponsors, they're not asking him anymore what his previous finish was or what tournaments he's taking part in next year. They're talking about how he can help with their sustainability endeavors now. So that's also a way that we can kind of maybe engage maybe less high profile athletes to talk about sustainability and get involved in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. Agreed. And I think, there's lots more that I can kind of go into. We're working with a young 16-year-old at Arsenal who's partnered with one of their new brands, Octopus Energy, providing electric energy for fans coming to stadiums. And he's been the ambassador for that. They haven't chosen the stars, the manager, any of the headline sort of players. They've chosen him. He's 16 years old, and he's part of that generation that does have a big influence. They're seeing it. They're seeing the consequences of previous generations, and they're the ones who want to do something about it. So I think, as you say, micro, macro, it's difficult where to start, but those smaller levels for those players, athletes, if they are passionate about it and they have been educated or they have some key points to say, I think, it's good that they do feel they have the possibilities to talk about it, speak to clubs about it, see where they can change. I mean, he was having a training session with his team recently, and after the training session, he encouraged all the players to go and pick up litter afterwards, which I thought was amazing. And that obviously generates a bit of conversation, and that might mean that the next kid does the same thing or does something different. But it's just sort of that slow build that obviously is great. And then maybe it's looking at the bigger names that maybe could have a look at ways that they could create the sort of more macro with good education, as you say, which is probably more of a challenge, but I think it's definitely doable.
That's a great story, Rory. That's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And we've had, as a basis, we've had just in the last month or so, we've had a couple of contacts from high-profile players actually starting to talk about this and wanting more information, more knowledge, so they can talk about this. But there is that whole credibility piece is absolutely key in it coming through. So I think, Michael, you had a comment. Do you want to jump in? And
yeah, thanks, Russell, and thanks, Matthew, as well, for a very interesting presentation. I'm just trying to think of the best way to articulate this, really. But I think one of the words that I'm not sure I've heard mentioned today is the word greenwashing. which is obviously an issue working in this space. And it's interesting that you mention an individual like Marcus Rashford that we're looking at as a sporting icon, really, as someone who can affect change in a positive way in our societies. And whilst Marcus Rashford has done a great amount of work on the food agenda, free school meals agenda in the UK, he is also partnered with Coca-Cola. So from a public health perspective, you've got, on the one hand, them doing a great deed in terms of providing food for children and young people, but also encouraging them to drink a product high in sugar that is bad for oral health, increases likelihood of weight gain, and of course is a huge plastic polluter as well. So I guess my question really is around that, maybe that hypocrisy issue, but more from a, let's put a positive spin on it, really. How do we protect sports entities and sports organizations from being taken advantage of from unhealthy commodity industries, for instance?
I'll just jump and add something. Sorry, Matthew, before you do respond to that. Look at the 100, the cricket tournament that just happened with the ECB, and I know we've got at least one person from ECB on the call, so apologies, but completely sponsored by snack brands, sort of high fat, poor quality foods, and this is going to a younger audience, targeted to a family audience.
So this is a really, really important question, Michael, and thanks for bringing it up. It's a bit of a minefield when it comes to sponsorship, isn't it? It's just where do you draw the line, really? Because you talk about oil and gas. I was really enjoying watching the Euros this summer, but then you see kind of Gazprom kind of lined up kind of all around the hoardings. Then you see companies like, you say, Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and like Russell said, the kind of crisp brands. Then you've got the airlines and automotive industries. The betting companies, for me, are among the worst, really, because you look at Premier League football clubs, and I reckon probably about a third, maybe, Premier League football clubs maybe are sponsored by betting teams.
Half.
Over half. Yeah, I mean, it's overwhelming, isn't it? Even in the Championship and now abroad, and even in the US, where sports betting is a semi-new phenomenon. We're seeing things like sports betting being kind of evangelized as a ways of increasing engagement in sport, which I think is very dangerous territory. But that's a conversation for another day. But I suppose so. My answer to that is, I think there needs to be a lot of, and when we talk about education for the athletes, I think education is an important word. I think we need to be looking to educate people who are involved in the commercial aspects of sport, people working in commercial teams, and who are putting these partnerships together and thinking about where they need to look for potential sponsors. Because I think it's all too easy to kind of partner with the kind of usual suspects like the betting organizations, because there'll always be a host of betting organizations wanting to sponsor particular Premier League football clubs, because their main audience is watching football. They want people to look at the shirts, get on their betting app, and spend some money on a couple of bets. But I think it's going to take some real education and creativity to get these kind of commercial teams to kind of think outside the box and look at other organizations that are perhaps a little more sustainable, a little more responsible. I mean, one of the things that I'm actually a Fulham fan. Unfortunately, I didn't think I'd admit that on this webinar, but I haven't bought any merchandise or their shirt for a number of years now, because they've had a betting sponsor for about 3 or 4 years in a row now. Mm-hmm. And this year they've changed their main sponsor, to an organization which I think creates mobile networks in rural parts of Africa, and they use renewable energy to build this network on. Now, I haven't done any research in this company, so I'm not speaking for them. But now I've got a reason to go and buy this shirt. I think it's fantastic, and someone's done some work in that commercial department to find a sponsor that is not among the tried and tested, the usual suspects, to find something that at least seems to be a responsible organization. But I think it's a difficult one, isn't it, Michael? I mean, sport, particularly the sports that are further down the track when it comes to revenue and money, mm-hmm. they've obviously got a smaller pool of potential sponsors that they're trying to wrestle from other rivals. And I suppose it just comes down to education and trying to find those brands that will be willing to engage and that you can align with your sport, that are not doing the bad things that, like fast food and fossil fuels and all that other bad stuff.
Yeah,
so I don't know if that's your question.
Well, yeah, I appreciate it's a very it's a difficult topic to discuss, and I don't think anyone's really got any answers. And of course, as you mentioned, where do you draw the line? Do you start excluding some of these sponsors, and then you bring in John's comments around financial sustainability? You ban airlines. That's a whole product group that can't sponsor sport. So it's a tough question. But as you said earlier, we've got to push in this direction, and we've got to look at, how we go about limiting some of the exposure or limiting the amount of influence they're having on their consumers through sport.
Yeah, definitely. I see we've got 5 minutes to go, and I know Patrick and James, I've just seen you pop your hands up. Just a quick anecdote on this. Some people may have seen this there was a TV documentary 3-4 weeks ago in the UK called, I think it was called Football's Betting Addiction, and Swansea City actually spoke about this, and their sponsorship manager, they'd had a betting company for a long 4 or 5 years as well, and they made a decision to not go with betting again, and they actually put Swansea University on their shirt, and I don't know the financial arrangement there, but apparently their shirt sales just increased quite rapidly for that season with Swansea University on there. And Swansea are now in the Championship at the moment. But the comment that was made in this documentary was, if we get back into the Premier League, we will not be able to compete financially. We will have to go back to a betting sponsor, because they're prepared to give 2 or 3 times the amount that any other shirt sponsor would give us. So just to compete to get money for players, we would do that. So sometimes there's a commercial reality that's attached to these. The return for those betting companies is so much bigger. But that is a bigger issue. There's a whole betting bill going through the UK Parliament at the moment, where these sorts of things have been reviewed. I'll bring in James. I will ask to be brief. I've got a couple more comments I need to make, and I'm going to try and bring in Jewel as well, if you're happy to speak, because you made a comment. But James, if you want to jump in.
Hey there. I just wanted to put a bit of a lens on it. I'm commercial partnerships manager at British Cycling, and I've been tasked with taking properties to market for close to 10 years. And it's one of those challenges. Is the brand alignment right? Is the fit right? And I just wanted to sort of echo those challenges. It's not, at the end of the day, you're pairing off your financial sustainability against your sort of your environmental impact and whether the brand's alignment. So we were very lucky to land HSBC as a lead partner back in 2016. They've supported us for 5 years and have been an incredible partner in helping us achieve a wider audience in terms of what the mass adoption of cycling, which is a great sustainable output. But if you dig deeper, there was people within the sport of cycling that were very unhappy with HSBC, with their background in money laundering and supporting Mexican cartels and all the bad press that a big brand like that attracts. You just have to take a pragmatic approach, I feel, and you need to see sort of sometimes beyond those sort of those stories and try and work out where the real tangible value in a partnership is. And HSBC have been a great partner for us over the years, and have done far more for sort of moving the sort of cycling dial than other brands perhaps could have. I just wanted to make that point, really. It wasn't really a question. I just wanted to put a perspective on it.
Patrick, do you want to jump in as well? Maybe Matthew can respond in a sec.
Sure. Thanks, Russell. I'll try and keep this as concise as possible. I suppose one of the things, I'm quite new to this area professionally, and one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of months in particular is in speaking to the people who run large sporting organizations and in talking to them about very broadly about the 3 kind of the broadest areas of environmental sustainability: energy, transport, and food. They're quite happy to talk about energy, where they get it from, if they can create it, etc., how they can reduce it. They're happy to talk about transport and different ways of getting fans around, different ways of transporting the sports around, etc., etc. The one area where they're really reluctant to even get into discussion about it is in the area of food and production of animal products and everything behind that. I guess my question is, do Matthew or yourself, Russell, do you guys have any suggestions or examples of, beyond the Forest Green Rovers and the vegan menu at the stadium, examples of people who have moved in a positive way in that area?
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Russell.
No, I was just trying to think of examples. I mean, one that springs to mind would be Glamorgan County Cricket Ground with their food. I think they source more than half within a 25-mile radius of the venue. Has been put into policy. So, look, food is a huge impact, both in terms of production and in terms of waste. So policies around, as you say, energy, transport, food are the key ones. And I think food will be the elephant in the room for sport moving forward. And all events, to be honest. I mean, I do know of one other event venue which says they won't use any food which has been transported by aeroplane, just to cut down food miles. So there are some organisations there, but you're absolutely right. There aren't too many that are looking at their food and food waste.
Yeah,
I think a really interesting one to look at would be, this is on a grander scale than most other sports, but I think the Paris 2024 Olympics is doing a lot around local sourcing of food. I think there's a certain kilometre kind of radius they're kind of going to source their food from. And I think the other interesting thing about that is that I think they're working with smaller micro enterprises as well to kind of engage social businesses as well. So they're looking at not just the environmental element, but the social element as well. So they're kind of looking at both strands of that sustainability dial. So that can be quite an interesting one to look at if you're interested, Patrick.
Great, thanks, guys.
And there's a couple of clubs. Arsenal have already been mentioned. I don't think we're not promoting Arsenal too much. I'm pretty sure at their training ground they've actually got sort of a small, we'll call it an allotment. I don't think it's grand enough to be a farm, but they've got an area where they're actually growing some of their food, growing some of their salad crops, vegetables, that sort of thing. And that's happening more and more in the US. There's one stadium which, if it has a vertical farm, they're actually growing their own salads and whatever in these big vertical tubes and this sort of thing. So there is some innovation there, but it's very, very new. And I think food is something that's easy to keep at arm's length, given that so many venues actually have, a third party that comes in to deliver catering, that sort of thing. So it's a tricky one, but it's certainly one that the basis we're going to start looking at in a lot more detail moving forward. We're at 3 o'clock. I promised we'd finish then. I've got a couple of minutes for announcements to make, but there was one other question, and I've got a few more, Matthew, but we can talk another time. Jewel came on and asked the question about what's your take on administrative bodies and their responsibility in furthering social sustainability and awareness, and gives the example of UEFA rejecting the request of lighting up the Allianz Arena in rainbow colours. UEFA wanted to be politically neutral on that, so should there be more support from those kind of organisations?
Yeah, I mean that was an interesting one, wasn't it? I think UEFA, that was a big PR own goal from UEFA's point of view, wasn't it? But I think their kind of their response was that because it was in direct retaliation to the Hungarian government's rule, that's why they didn't do it, because it was seen as a political statement. But I mean, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to social issues, I mean, I think John came up with, talked about it right at the very beginning of the conversation, that when we talk about sustainability, we talk about the 3 pillars of sustainability: the social, the environmental, and the financial side of it. And if you're an NGB, or if you're an international federation, of course, looking at the social side of things is just as important as the environmental side of things. However, I do think sport has a bit more pedigree in the social side of sustainability than environmental. Many sports have foundations of some kind. Even federations and football clubs will be looking at social stuff, I think, to a larger extent than environment. But yes, I mean, there's lots more to do on both aspects.
Yeah, definitely. Lovely, Matty. Thank you. We do need to finish now. So thanks very much. Insightful as always. Always enjoy a conversation. Just a few announcements from a basis perspective, if I may. So our next webinar, Matthew's already alluded to, that's going to be the 15th of September. We're going to have Extreme E talking about the new racing series, the messaging behind it. Everything around this is built around a sustainability messaging and the legacy that they leave in each of their racing locations. So I think just a couple of weeks before, they would have had the challenge of setting up an off-road race on the ice cap in Greenland. And just an aside, last week was the first ever recording of rain falling on the peak of the Greenland ice cap. It was warm enough, there was rain rather than snow, and that's never been recorded before. So climate change, global warming again. In addition, in September, we've got a few members only events. So first one, we've got our members lounge, an opportunity for all of our members to network and ask questions of each other, of basis, about whatever issues they're currently looking at. So 9:30 on Tuesday, the 7th of September. The next day, we've got one of our regular Commonwealth climate conversations with our colleagues from the Sport Environment Alliance in Australia and New Zealand. So that'll be at 8:30 on the morning of Wednesday, the 8th. And then at 9:30 on the 23rd of September, we've got a members solutions forum where we're looking at water availability and delivery, and then future impacts and regulation that may happen. And most importantly, from our perspective, all of that is important, but most importantly, this year is actually the 10th anniversary for BASIS. So Tuesday, 19th of October, we've got a lunchtime event at the Kia Oval to celebrate that 10th anniversary, but also it's our inaugural Sustainable Sports Awards. So any members, tickets are free for members to attend. Non-members, tickets are available to buy. So please email us at info@basis.org.uk for information on that. We're still receiving nominations. We're looking for nominations. That runs up till the 10th of September. So we're encouraging everybody to enter. Completely free to enter, and we're keen to receive entries, whether you're big or small, whether it's professional venue or local recreational club. Please enter. We don't have categories as such, but we just want to be able to recognise sort of impactful and innovative sustainability projects. So again, look at the website www.basis.org.uk. We've gone over by 5 minutes. I always try to be on time, but it was a good conversation. So thanks to everybody who contributed, but absolutely to Matthew. Thanks for your time and for delivering such an interesting webinar.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks to everyone for joining in and asking questions.
Thanks, everybody. See you again.